When studying naval history, German cruisers are an interesting topic. The cruisers of the Great War have some pretty big names, notably Emden and Königsberg, among others. And you see a similar situation with the Second World War, where a couple names overshadow the others. In this case, Admiral Hipper and Prinz Eugen, along with the Panzerschiff once you get beyond calling them pocket battleships. However, one cruiser would outlive all of these examples. A humble light cruiser, Nürnberg. This ship survived the Second World War. In fact, she was, along with Prinz Eugen, the only functional German warship larger than a destroyer. This made her a decent bargaining chip in the post-war negotiations. Negotiations that would ultimately see Nürnberg handed over to the Soviet Union as a war prize. Unlike the Americans, who subjected Prinz Eugen to atomic testing, the Soviets kept Nürnberg around. Renamed Admiral Makarov, she spent a good deal of time in Soviet service. First as a popular flagship for the Baltic Fleet. Then, after 1954, as a training ship, where her ultimate fate varies a bit from source to source. But a common consensus is that the ship was, most likely, scrapped by 1960. This would make her the longest-lived major warship of the Kriegsmarine, not to mention the only one to see active service after the war, unlike, again, Prinz Eugen, which was commissioned as USS Prinz Eugen, but only for the aforementioned atomic testing. In fact, Nürnberg lasted longer as Admiral Makarov than she did under her German name, by about 5 years. That alone makes her interesting to me. But the rest of her service is also worth noting, because this ship lives something of a charmed life, especially compared to the other German cruisers, particularly her very unfortunate sister, Leipzig, which I've covered before and can link in the description. Regardless, let's begin where Nürnberg's story started, as the second of the Leipzig-class cruisers, which were themselves the second class of interwar German light cruiser, following up on the very similar Königsberg class, and the third design overall, counting the one-off Emden. Although Nürnberg was different enough, even compared to her sister, that she's sometimes considered a one-off. This was mostly down to size. Leipzig displaced 8,100 tons at her full load. Nürnberg was nearly a full 1,000 tons heavier at around 9,000 tons. Leipzig was 177 meters, 580 feet long. Nürnberg was 181 meters, or 594 feet long. Both ships did share the same beam of 16.3 meters, or 53 feet. When it came to weaponry, then, both ships shared the same main battery. 9 15-centimeter, 5.9-inch guns in 3 triple turrets, 1 on the bow and 2 on the stern. The secondary battery, meanwhile, was fairly light, heavier than her sister, but not exactly heavy. Nürnberg carried 8 88mm guns and 4 twin mounts, whereas Leipzig carried 2 older 88mm guns with a further 2 added later, with more dedicated anti-aircraft weaponry on Nürnberg coming from 8 37mm cannon and a further 8 20mm guns, with weaponry rounded off by 12 torpedoes and 4 triple launchers. Armor protection, for its part, would be fairly minimal. A 50mm 2-inch thick main belt with a 30mm 1.2-inch thick deck, Even by the standards of light cruisers, that's not much. Just for comparison, the Atlanta class, infamously skimpy on armor, reached just under 4 inches on the belt, 3.75 inches to be specific. This was a legacy of treaty restrictions and trying to keep tonnage as slim as possible. That aside, let's move on to speed to finish this section. Nürnberg could reach around 32 knots on 60,000 horsepower, through 2 shafts and 2 steam turbines, while the ship's third centerline shaft was 12,400 horsepower, from 4 diesel engines. A definite German quirk there. In any event, though, that wraps up the design details. Now we can return to service history, which does, admittedly, follow the pattern of Germany's Baltic fleet in a lot of ways. If you've watched my videos on Second World War German warships, well, you know what I mean. For those who haven't, let's get into it. This story began in November 1933 when the ship was laid down in Kiel, Germany. Her construction at this point went remarkably fast. The ship was launched on December 6, 1934, and commissioned less than a year later on November 2, 1935. So she was launched in a little over a year and took only a little under another year for the fitting out process. Now, for a peacetime ship of any description, that is impressive. Less impressive by comparison was the initial service. As noted, this was peacetime. Nürnberg would spend early 1936 working up in the Baltic, before joining her sister on an Atlantic training cruise. After this, it was more Baltic training until August of 1936. With Spain descending into civil war, Nürnberg was dispatched on August 19th for the Neutrality Patrol. She would ultimately make 4 patrols off the Spanish coast over the late 1930s, although these were largely uneventful. At least she wasn't bombed. Aside from this, Nürnberg spent the second half of the 1930s on various fleet exercises and training duty, along with the odd fleet review or refit. Nothing particularly major as the last few years of peace wound down. Arguably, the first real excitement for this ship came relatively late. Nürnberg would be part of the fleet anchored off Lithuania when Germany occupied the Memel region. This came in March 1939, a few short months before war broke out, with Nürnberg's last notable voyage prior to the Second World War coming in April of 1939, a short training cruise in the Mediterranean, including stopovers in Spain, with the ship back in the Baltic and training by May 1939. She was still there when the old battleship Schleswig-Holstein shelled Poland on September 1st, 1939, opening the Second World War. As for Nürnberg, she joined a German task force in attempting to blockade Polish ports. The goal of this operation was simple: prevent the Polish fleet from escaping either to neutral Sweden or to Britain. Now, in fairness, it did prevent most of the smaller Polish surface fleet from escaping. However, most of the Polish destroyers had sailed to Britain in late August. Only one was left behind, and this was sunk by German aircraft. Nürnberg would, as such, shift away from this blockade on September 3rd, moving instead to mine-laying work in the North Sea. This lasted until September 20th, at which point the ship returned to Baltic patrol duty, at least for October of 1939. with the cruiser sent back out into the North Sea on November 12, 1939, for one of the odder missions any light cruiser ever undertook. This saw Nürnberg head out to escort 6 destroyers back to Germany from their own mine-laying work, a mission the cruiser would actually repeat on November 17th and again on December 12th. I'll admit, it probably seems a bit odd to use cruisers to escort destroyers. Isn't it normally the reverse? The logic, such as it was, came down to Germany's chronic lack of destroyers. Most of the active destroyers were being used on the minesweeping. Torpedo boats would sometimes join the cruisers, but on December 12th, most of those were down for refit. As a result, the Germans sent out 3 light cruisers: Nürnberg, Leipzig, and Köln. This was a bit of a mess from the start. First, the cruisers waved down a Danish merchant, Charkov, but as the ship was neutral, the Germans let her go. They continued on their mission, only to be spotted and tracked by a British scout aircraft around 11 a.m. That scout remained overhead as the German cruisers were attacked at 11:25. The submarine HMS Salmon fired off 2 spreads of torpedoes. The first saw Leipzig take a torpedo amidships. The second saw Nürnberg hit at the tip of her bow. Of the 2, Leipzig definitely fared worse. At this point, the German cruisers limped home. They had to fend off air attacks all the while, but further damage was avoided, even with communication issues preventing a proper rendezvous with the destroyers until later in the day. Not until around 1:40 p.m. as it turned out. Still, the Germans made it back to port, with repairs to Nürnberg keeping her out of the invasion of Norway in April of 1940. When you consider the savaging the German cruiser force took in that particular operation, well, this was probably a good thing for Nürnberg, with the ship only returning to service in June of 1940, although she wouldn't see further direct combat against the British fleet. At first, Nürnberg was sent to Norway for escort duty. This saw her arrive at Narvik on June 17th, where she would remain for about a month. However, very little of note actually happened, outside of one of her float planes attempting to sink a British submarine. As a result, Nürnberg would ultimately be sent back home on July 25th, as part of the escort for Gneisenau. That ship had been torpedoed by another British submarine on June 20th. Temporary repair work got her underway by the end of July, with Nürnberg serving as part of the escort. The rest of 1940 would be uneventful, as the ship was held in reserve for the potential Operation Sea Lion. The invasion of Britain, that has spawned 1,000 terrible alternate history scenarios. As this never happened, Nürnberg remained in reserve, until she was reclassified as a training ship on February 7, 1941, along with the other surviving light cruisers. For the most part, this would be her role for the rest of the war, with a couple exceptions. The first of which came fairly early with the invasion of the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941. Nürnberg would join Tirpitz in blocking any attempted sortie by the Soviet Baltic Fleet. When this failed to materialize, however, the operation was called off by October. Nürnberg would revert to training duty, aside from a short stint in Norway, starting in December 1941. This was done to cover the refit of Admiral Scheer, although Nürnberg saw no combat. She just bounced between Norwegian ports for a few months, with the ship ultimately sent back to Germany in April 1943, where she once more took up training ship duty for the remainder of the year and most of 1944. The German surface fleet was mostly out of the war by this point, excepting North Cape and Scharnhorst loss. This only changed in late 1944 when the surviving German surface forces returned to duty, not for surface battles, but as escorts, and for shore bombardment as the Soviets pushed further and further into German territory. Nürnberg, however, was limited to escort duty and mine-laying work. She wouldn't turn her guns ashore, unlike the other German warships, with the cruiser out of the war entirely on January 27, 1945. She was moored in Copenhagen out of fuel and unable to leave, although this likely saved the ship. The British didn't bomb Denmark's capital, unlike German ports. That preserved Nürnberg, aside from an attempt by the Danish resistance to seize the cruiser on May 5th, which only led to both sides suffering losses in a dockside shootout. Ultimately, the cruiser was seized by the British on May 22, 1945. Nürnberg was refueled and sent off to Wilhelmshaven on May 24th, where the cruiser was handed over as reparations on January 2, 1946, to the Soviet Union, who probably would have preferred Prinz Eugen. But they took what they could get, and Nürnberg was at least a fully functional cruiser. The Soviets would commission the ship as Admiral Makarov, although she wouldn't see much service. With the Soviet Union at peace, the cruiser reverted to her training role. From February 1946 through to December 1955, she was flagship of the Baltic Fleet, and from all indications, a very well-liked one. The ship would see various refits, but these mostly focused on the electronic systems. For the most part, Admiral Makarov remained in her German layout. Her main battery was the same, and so were the secondaries. Even the anti-aircraft battery remained largely unchanged. However, the ship's service life couldn't last forever. She remained a one-off and an aging one. A boiler explosion in 1957 simply sealed an inevitable fate. This came on February 21st, 1957. And while the damage was relatively minor, the Soviets saw no need to keep the ship in active service. Admiral Makarov was downrated to a barrack ship, with the cruiser ultimately decommissioned in 1959 and scrapped in 1960. Although I've seen it cited that the cruiser lasted until 1967 before the scrapping was finally completed. She may not have had an exciting life, but in both German and Soviet navies, well, Nürnberg was a reliable and well-liked ship. And in the end, isn't that what really matters? Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.